I always thought that when your life falls apart, you'd see it coming. There would be signs, arguments, distance, maybe even a gut feeling whispering that something was wrong. But for me, it happened in an instant. One sentence, one moment, and suddenly, everything I believed about my marriage crumbled into nothing. It was late. Not the kind of late where the world is asleep, but the kind where the streets are quiet, the lights in most houses are dim, and you feel like an outsider looking in at your own life. I had just parked my car outside our home, exhausted from another long shift. My wife, Miriam, had stopped waiting up for me months ago. It didn't bother me much. I figured she just had her own routine. But as I walked up the driveway, my hand reaching for the door handle, I heard her voice. Muffled, just behind the window, but clear enough that I knew she wasn't alone. Sometimes, I feel like I can't stand being around him anymore. My heart stopped. There was silence for a moment, and then another voice, one I didn't recognize. A woman's voice. Then why don't you just leave? Miriam let out a bitter laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from her in years. Because it's not that simple. He's too predictable. Too steady. I don't even think he'd know what to do without me. I wish he'd just get the hint. I stood frozen, my keys clutched in my hand, my body refusing to move. The words should have made me angry, but all I felt was hollow. She wished I would get the hint? That I'd disappear? Something inside me cracked. I don't remember making a decision, not consciously. But I turned around, walked back to my car, and drove away without looking back. That was the last time Miriam saw me, or at least, the version of me she thought she knew. I didn't plan on vanishing. It wasn't some grand scheme or a carefully crafted act of revenge. It was instinct, pure, unfiltered instinct. The moment I drove away from that house, from the life I had built with Miriam, I felt something strange, something I wasn't prepared for. Relief. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Not even the bitterness I probably should have felt. Just a lightness in my chest, as if I had been holding my breath for years and had only now let it go. The weight of a marriage that had long since turned into an obligation was suddenly gone, and in its place was a terrifying yet intoxicating sense of nothing. I drove for hours that night, my phone vibrating in the cup holder. I didn't need to look at the screen to know it wasn't Miriam. She never called me unless she needed something. Maybe that was the biggest sign I had ignored all these years, how little she actually cared where I was or what I was doing. No, the calls were from my bank. Automatic alerts, notifying me that I had just drained half of our joint account into my personal one. I hadn't even realized I was doing it, my fingers moving over the banking app while I sat at a gas station somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It was a reflex, a subconscious act of self-preservation. I wasn't about to leave my entire life behind without at least securing my own survival. The house? She could have it. The furniture, the car, even the dog we never got around to adopting because she didn't want the responsibility. None of it mattered to me anymore. By sunrise, I had rented a motel room under a name I had never used before, Lowell Fields. My middle name and my mother's maiden name. Something that felt like mine but wasn't tied to the man I had been for the past 10 years. The man who had worked late shifts to pay for a house that was never really his. The man who had adjusted, compromised, and made himself smaller just to keep a marriage together that, in the end, wasn't worth saving. I turned off my phone. I cut myself off. And for the first time in years, I was free. The next few days were a blur. I moved through them like a ghost, existing but not really feeling. I slept when I wanted, ate when I felt like it, and ignored the outside world. No one knew where I was, and the sheer anonymity of it all felt surreal. I wasn't Lowell Greaves, the dependable husband Miriam had grown tired of. I was nobody, and for the moment, I liked it that way. Then, on the 5th day, it happened. I had been sitting in a small diner, sipping coffee and staring at the morning paper like I had a single clue what I was doing with my life when the TV on the wall caught my attention. It was the local news, the kind of broadcast that covered more lost cats than actual crime, but then I heard my name. Authorities are asking for any information regarding the whereabouts of local resident Lowell Greaves, who was last seen on. I barely heard the rest. My own face flashed on the screen, an old photo from some work event I barely remembered attending. Next to it was Miriam, eyes red-rimmed, sitting in our living room. My living room. She was crying. I almost laughed. The woman who had said she couldn't stand being around me anymore was now on television, begging for someone to find me? I turned up the volume just as she spoke. I don't understand. He left without a word. No note. No sign. He took his things, his money, and just disappeared. Please, if anyone sees him, tell him to come home. I don't know what I did to deserve this. She didn't know what she did? My grip on the coffee cup tightened. The hypocrisy of it all made my stomach churn. I wasn't stupid. I knew exactly what was happening. Miriam had spent years slowly pushing me away, hoping I'd be the one to finally break. And now that I had actually left, really left, and taken my stability with me, now she was playing the grieving wife for the cameras? No, I wouldn't fall for it. I had given her 10 years of my life. She had spent those years growing bored of me, wishing me away, waiting for me to be the one to walk out so she wouldn't have to be the bad guy. Well, congratulations, Miriam. You got what you wanted. I wasn't coming back. But something told me she wasn't going to let that happen so easily. I sat there in the diner, staring at the screen, watching my wife sob for the cameras. If I didn't know her, I might have actually believed the performance. But I did know her. I knew her too well. Miriam wasn't crying because she missed me. She wasn't crying because she was worried. She was crying because she had lost control. For the past 10 years, I had been the rock she leaned on, the background character in her carefully curated life. Predictable, steady, safe. She had the freedom to do whatever she wanted because she knew I'd always be there, always picking up the pieces, always making sure things stayed stable. And now? Now, I had done the one thing she never expected. I left. And I didn't just leave. I erased myself. I took another sip of my coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue as I watched her crocodile tears fall. I just don't understand, she repeated, voice trembling in just the right way to make her sound sympathetic. Lowell was always so devoted. He worked hard, he was reliable. I never thought he'd do something like this. Something like what, Miriam? Walk away from a marriage you stopped caring about? Give you the space you were so desperate for? It was almost funny. She had wanted me gone, and now that she was acting like I was the one who abandoned her. The news anchor nodded, sympathetic but detached. And there was no sign that anything was wrong? Miriam shook her head, a little too quickly. No, nothing. We were fine. I mean, sure, we had our ups and downs, like any couple, but he never said anything. Never gave any indication that he was unhappy. If he was struggling, I wish he had talked to me. I had to put my cup down before I crushed it in my hand. She was good. Really good. If I didn't have the memory of that night burned into my brain, if I hadn't heard her with my own ears, I might have second-guessed myself. But I had heard her. I had heard her tell someone else she couldn't stand being around me anymore. I had heard the exhaustion in her voice, the frustration, the complete lack of love. I closed my eyes and exhaled slowly, forcing myself to let go of the tension in my shoulders. None of this mattered. I was gone. I had no intention of crawling back, no desire to explain myself to people who had already made up their minds. I had spent years putting her first, considering her feelings, trying to be enough for her. I was done. But then the screen shifted, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. A picture of me. Not the old work event photo they had used before. This was different. This was recent. It was me, getting out of my car. The same car I had driven away in. The same car I had parked in front of the motel 2 nights ago. I hadn't noticed anyone taking a picture of me. I hadn't thought anyone even knew where I was. But someone did. My stomach dropped as the news anchor continued. A witness has come forward claiming to have seen Lowell Greaves 2 days ago at a motel outside of town. The individual, who wishes to remain anonymous, states that he appeared distant, distracted, and not himself. The diner suddenly felt too small, too quiet. My fingers curled into fists against the table. Who had seen me? Who had recognized me? I had been careful. I had paid in cash. I hadn't used my real name. Had Miriam sent someone to find me? I couldn't stay here. I threw some cash on the table and walked out, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The air outside was cold, biting at my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was racing. Someone had found me. Someone had told her. I needed to disappear again. For good. I barely remembered getting into my car. My hands were gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my knuckles turning white as I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I had been careful, so damn careful. I thought I had control over my own disappearance, that I had slipped away without leaving a single thread for Miriam to pull. But I was wrong. Someone had seen me. Someone had told her. And now, she was using the media to reel me back in, playing the devastated wife, while sending people to track me down. I had underestimated her. A deep breath rattled in my chest as I turned the key in the ignition. I couldn't stay at the motel any longer. If someone had spotted me once, they could do it again. I needed to move, farther, faster. But as I pulled out onto the empty road, the reality of it all started pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Who had seen me? And more importantly, why had they spoken up? I hadn't interacted with anyone except a few cashiers and motel clerks. Was it one of them? Had someone recognized my face from the news and thought they were helping a lost husband return home? Or had Miriam put someone on my trail, feeding them a sob story about how I had lost myself and needed to be found? The thought of her controlling the narrative made my stomach turn. For 10 years, I had been the steady one, the reasonable one. The one who worked overtime when we needed extra cash. The one who compromised when she wanted to redecorate the entire house on a whim. The one who apologized first after arguments, even when I wasn't the one who started them. And now? Now, I was the one who had snapped. I was the husband who had mysteriously vanished, leaving his poor, confused wife behind with no explanation. She was already rewriting history, erasing all the nights she had ignored me, all the conversations where I tried to reach her and got nothing but indifference in return. She had wanted me gone, and yet the moment she got what she wished for, she had turned it into a tragedy. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead. I couldn't let her drag me back into her version of events. I had spent enough time living inside the world she built. I had finally taken control of my own life, and I wasn't about to let her pull me back. But where the hell was I supposed to go now? I had money, but not an unlimited amount. I had no plan, no destination, just an overwhelming need to stay gone. I pulled into a gas station just outside of town, keeping my head down as I filled up the tank. Every person I saw felt like a potential threat. The old man sipping coffee by the entrance, the teenager scrolling on his phone near the pumps, even the cashier inside. They all had the power to recognize me, to send me right back into Miriam's grasp. I paid in cash and kept driving. Hours passed in a blur of empty roads and forgotten towns. I stopped when I needed to, slept in the car instead of risking another motel, kept moving as soon as the sun rose. But the further I got, the less it felt like I was escaping. Because no matter how far I ran, I couldn't outrun her. Miriam had a way of twisting things, of bending reality until even I questioned what was true. And if she had managed to get me on the news, it meant she wasn't done playing the role of the abandoned wife. No, this was just the beginning. She wanted me to come back. Or worse, she wanted me to break. And I had no idea which one terrified me more. The road stretched endlessly ahead, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt winding through unfamiliar towns, forgotten gas stations, and stretches of land where even the streetlights seemed reluctant to exist. I had been driving for what felt like days, stopping only for gas, food, and to splash cold water on my face in dingy rest stop bathrooms. Sleep had become a luxury I could barely afford. My car, once a simple mode of transportation, was now my refuge. My prison. The weight of what I had done, of what I had become, was finally settling in. I wasn't just a man who had left his wife. I was a man on the run from his own life. And no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Paranoia crept in like a slow-moving fog, clinging to my skin, whispering that every stranger I passed was watching me too closely. I had made sure to pay in cash, to keep my head down, to avoid drawing any attention to myself. But someone had found me once. Someone had leaked my whereabouts to the news. That meant I had slipped up. And if I had slipped up once, I could slip up again. I needed a new plan. Stopping in another town, another anonymous motel wasn't an option anymore. I had to disappear completely. But how? Changing my name again wouldn't be enough. If someone had recognized me in that tiny, middle-of-nowhere diner, then I couldn't trust that a new identity would keep me safe. I needed something more drastic. Pulling into a nearly empty parking lot of an old convenience store, I sat in my car, staring at my reflection in the windshield. My face was gaunt, my eyes hollow from exhaustion. I barely recognized the man looking back at me. And maybe that was exactly what I needed. Stepping inside, I walked straight to the toiletries aisle, grabbing a razor and scissors before heading to the back where a rack of cheap hoodies and baseball caps hung. I bought everything without making eye contact with the cashier and took it all back to the car. The first cut of the scissors felt surreal. My hair, something Miriam had always liked longer, fell into my lap in uneven clumps. The razor followed, stripping away more than just hair. It took the last remnants of the man I used to be. By the time I was finished, I didn't look like Lowell anymore. I looked like a ghost of someone who had never existed. For the first time in days, a sense of control settled over me. It was small, fragile, but it was something. I could work with this. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, ready to disappear again, my phone, my new burner phone, buzzed from the seat beside me. No one had the number. No one. I felt my pulse spike as I reached for it, flipping it over to see a single message from an unknown number. "You really thought you could just leave?" My hands clenched around the phone, the words searing into my brain. My mouth went dry. My stomach turned to lead. She had found me. Again. I gripped the phone so tightly that my knuckles went white. The message on the screen stared back at me like a silent accusation. "You really thought you could just leave?" My chest tightened. The air in the car suddenly felt too thick, the walls of my world closing in faster than I could process. I had done everything right, everything. New name, new look, cash transactions, no digital footprints. And yet, somehow, she had still found me. A dozen possibilities raced through my head. Did she track my bank withdrawals? No. I had been careful. Had someone else recognized me? Maybe. But the worst, most disturbing possibility was the one I couldn't ignore. Was she just watching me? I scanned the parking lot outside the convenience store, my eyes darting between the few scattered cars and flickering streetlights. There were no obvious signs of someone lurking, no dark figures standing in the shadows waiting to pounce. But the paranoia that had been simmering beneath my skin since the moment I left home exploded into full-blown panic. I had to move. Now. With shaking hands, I yanked the phone apart, pulling the SIM card out and tossing it onto the pavement outside before slamming the car into drive and peeling out of the lot. The tires screeched against the pavement, drawing the attention of a couple of teenagers leaning against the store's brick wall, but I didn't care. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I drove. Fast. No plan, no destination, just away. Every car that appeared behind me in the dark felt like a tale. Every streetlight overhead felt like an interrogation lamp exposing me. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind screaming at me to think, to do something before it was too late. After nearly an hour of aimless driving, I finally pulled off the highway onto a deserted back road, the kind of place where GPS signals got weak and the world felt like it had forgotten you existed. I parked the car behind an abandoned gas station, killing the engine. Silence swallowed me whole. I exhaled slowly, my hands still gripping the wheel. I needed to stop and think. If I let the fear take over, I'd make a mistake. And I couldn't afford mistakes. First, the phone. I couldn't use any phone now. Not even another burner. If Miriam had gotten that number, that meant she had resources I hadn't accounted for. Maybe she had convinced the police to track me. Maybe she had private investigators on my trail. Or maybe she was just smarter than I had given her credit for. Second, the car. It was a liability. Too easy to trace. I needed to ditch it. I stepped outside, the night air biting against my skin. The highway was distant enough that only the occasional whoosh of a passing vehicle reached my ears. No one would see me here. That was the point. Popping the trunk, I grabbed the only things that mattered: cash, an extra hoodie, and the few supplies I had been smart enough to pack. The rest? Useless now. I locked the doors and started walking. Where? I had no idea. But I knew one thing for certain. Miriam wanted me to come back. She wanted me to break. And I would rather become a ghost than give her the satisfaction. The road stretched before me, endless and uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't thinking about where I was going. My mind was locked on her. Miriam, the woman I had spent 10 years with. The woman I had thought I knew. But now, as I walked through the darkness with only the sound of my own footsteps for company, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. I never really knew her at all. Sure, I knew the surface-level things. Her favorite wine, the way she always slept facing the door, the way she would hum under her breath when she cooked. But I didn't know her. I didn't know what she was truly capable of. And now, I was starting to understand just how dangerous that ignorance had been. She had found me. Twice. That meant she wasn't just sitting at home, crying for the cameras, waiting for me to return like some lost puppy. She was hunting me. The thought made my stomach turn. How far was she willing to go? What was her endgame? If she had wanted me gone, she could have easily filed for divorce, taken whatever she wanted, and moved on. But she hadn't. Instead, she had turned my disappearance into a spectacle. She wasn't trying to find me because she missed me. She was trying to find me because she needed control. I kept walking, my mind racing through every interaction we had ever had, searching for signs I had missed. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Miriam had always been rewriting reality. There had been little things, subtle manipulations. The way she would twist arguments, making me feel like I was overreacting. The way she would rewrite the past, insisting that things had happened differently than I remembered. And I had always believed her. Because why wouldn't I? She was my wife. But now, standing at the edge of a highway with nothing but the clothes on my back and a bag of stolen freedom slung over my shoulder, I saw the truth for what it was. She had been conditioning me for years. I had spent a decade apologizing for things I didn't do. A decade doubting myself. A decade shrinking so she wouldn't be uncomfortable. And the moment I finally broke free, the moment I did the one thing she never expected, she flipped the script again. Now, I wasn't the victim. I was the villain. The unstable husband who had suddenly snapped. The man who abandoned his wife without a word. And if I wasn't careful, she would make sure the whole world believed it. I needed a plan. Running wasn't enough. I had been so focused on escaping that I hadn't thought about what came next. But now, I understood that there was no running from Miriam. If I wanted to end this, I had to do something I had never done before. I had to be smarter than her. I had to be one step ahead. And for the first time, I knew exactly where to start. I had spent so much time running, so much time trying to disappear, that I hadn't stopped to ask myself a simple question. Why was I the one running? Miriam had spent years manipulating me, twisting my reality until I doubted my own instincts. Even now, after finally breaking free, I was still playing by her rules. I had let her control the story. I had let her make me the villain. But not anymore. I wasn't the one who had something to hide. She was. I stood at the edge of an unfamiliar town, watching the flickering neon signs of a roadside diner in the distance. I had made my decision. I wasn't running anymore. I was taking my life back. Instead of avoiding the world, I stepped into it. I walked into the diner, sat down at the counter, and did something I hadn't done in days. I spoke to someone. A waitress with tired eyes and a kind smile placed a cup of coffee in front of me, and for the first time, I felt real. I wasn't some ghost wandering from town to town, looking over my shoulder. I was a man reclaiming his story. I opened my wallet, pulled out the one thing I had kept, a USB drive. It was small, almost insignificant, but I knew what was on it. Proof. I had been keeping records for years. At first, it had been unintentional, a habit of saving old messages, recordings of financial discussions, documents Miriam had insisted I sign without reading. But now, those scraps of evidence had turned into something powerful. Miriam had built her world on manipulation and lies. She had always been careful, always making sure no one else could see the cracks beneath her perfect image. But now, I had everything I needed to expose the truth. Instead of hiding, I made calls. Instead of running, I reached out to people who could help me, a lawyer, a journalist, even a private investigator who specialized in uncovering fraudulent abuse claims. Because I knew Miriam wouldn't stop at just tracking me down. If I let her, she'd paint me as unstable. She'd destroy my reputation. Maybe even worse. But I wasn't playing her game anymore. Days passed, and for the first time, I felt hope. I wasn't just reacting to her moves, I was ahead of her. I wasn't the missing husband anymore. I was the man who had finally outsmarted the woman who thought she owned him. And then, the news broke. Miriam's tearful pleas had worked too well. The media had dug into my disappearance and found something she never expected. Her lies. Financial records that didn't add up. Witnesses who had heard her talk about how she wished I would just go away. Even old text messages where she had bragged to her friends about how she could get rid of me whenever she wanted. The world turned on her. And just like that, the control she had fought so hard to keep was gone. I watched from a distance as her empire of lies crumbled. She couldn't touch me anymore. No one was looking for me. No one believed her stories. The world had seen her for who she truly was, and I didn't even have to lift a finger to make it happen. For the first time in years, I could breathe. And as I drove down a new road, toward a new life, I smiled to myself. I wasn't a prisoner in her world anymore. I was free.